Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the speakers, and we'll move on to the panel discussion. I do want to introduce someone on our panel who is one of our faculty here, Julie Parsonnet, who just returned from Antarctica, and it's nice to see her here. She is one of the world's experts in H. pylori, and actually was one of the first to describe the association between H. pylori and gastric cancer, and she has a seminal paper in New England Journal of Medicine back in 1991. That's probably one of the most highly cited papers in gastric cancer research. And so we have a wonderful panel here. I want to just reassure everybody on time. I intentionally padded the schedule toward the end, and we'll have alcohol at the end. We'll have a little reception. No smoked meat, but I'd like to open the floor up for discussion. I think this one is a particularly important panel that would love to field some questions on. So is there anyone in particular who would like to kick off the questions? I know that there were a lot of H. pylori questions this morning. I will, okay, go ahead. Please. Microphone.
Thank you. Well, it's me again with some H. pylori questions. So I saw there's some interest about doing this screen and treat approach, and there's concerns about having antibiotic resistance. And are you guys aware of any recent studies or any studies at all on the mutation rate of resistance? That is, if you have a susceptible strain of H. pylori and you treat that, what's the likelihood of developing resistance? And the reason I ask that, when I'll present tomorrow a mathematical model on this, and when I was doing this type of research, I only found one study with 8 individuals, and 3 of them developed resistance, and that was the only evidence at the time of the probability of mutation or induced resistance. So, and based on the results, you can see how sensible they are also in inducing resistance over a long time, and how quickly that screen and treat strategy for a particular line of treatment can become ineffective and obviously not cost effective on the long run. So I was wondering if you guys are aware of any recent studies, and what is the concern about it?
So I don't actually know anything that's been published on sort of mutation rates, but I will say that one of the best ways of knowing whether somebody is clarithromycin resistant is if they've ever had clarithromycin. That receiving clarithromycin in some form without having H. pylori eradication means that you will have H. pylori that's resistant to clarithromycin. So I can tell you that clarithromycin resistance is quite easy to get. There's a lot of question about what the other resistance patterns really mean. For instance, we know that if people have metronidazole resistance, they can still respond to metronidazole as part of their treatment, and it doesn't necessarily decrease treatment failure that much. And there still is small amounts, so only small amounts of resistance to other antibiotics. So the big issue is that clarithromycin is one of the best drugs for H. pylori and is one of the best tolerated drugs for H. pylori, and yet if somebody has received it, it just won't work. So I think that's the biggest issue about resistance. I don't know if there's anybody else in the audience who maybe knows anything more about that.
So I'll just make a few comments. Julie was right on the point. So I think that there were 3 guidelines that were published in 2017, and they each had sort of different algorithms that you would walk through depending on what stage a patient was and what they'd been treated with before. But I think that the guidelines that were from the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology really were the most practical, because they said if you know what the local community resistance rates to your H. pylori strains are, or if you know that a patient has responded well, or people have responded well to triple therapy, then that should be your first-line therapy. But the problem is that, at least in the United States, many people do not know that information. And the only studies that I'm aware of was this study called the HARP study in 2004, which looked at about 350 H. pylori strains from 10 sites in the United States and reported resistance rates. And then there was a single study from Baylor in 2015, and the worrisome thing that they reported was that they were looking at resistance rates over about a 6-year period, And when they fractionated out the clarithromycin resistance rates, they'd almost doubled in the latter 2 years of the study. And so because of that, I think that you're forced to use quadruple therapy for 2 weeks unless you really know what the resistance rates are. I mean, I can tell you in Nashville and at Vanderbilt, we don't know. And so I just think that is a practical sort of way to go, when we just don't have the data.
Yeah, but I think the bigger issue, perhaps the bigger issue, is not even the resistance. It's the microbiome community or microbiome advocates saying antibiotics are a dangerous thing, which I'm not knocking. There's a strong resistance. Antibiotics are very dangerous, and we need to be careful about that. And perhaps, Rick, you'll touch on that tomorrow, because I know you're an advocate of treating empirically even in some patients that don't have documented HP infection. But I think there's a community that would strongly disagree, for example.
Since Julie didn't give a talk, because we weren't sure about her availability, but since you're here and you have a long history of studying H. pylori and have proposed in the past of a test and treat for prevention of gastric cancer, where do you think we are today?
Thanks for that question.
I know it's broad.
Yeah, so I'll give a little history with that. So my first paper on H. pylori I wrote in 1987, before some people in this room were born, which is pretty sad. In 1991, we came out with a New England Journal paper on gastric cancer, and one of 2 papers that we wrote. And then 1994, was the IARC meeting, saying that it was a group 1 carcinogen. And so I went up to somebody who's been mentioned today, Doug Owens, who came into Stanford the same year I did. And I had scrawled on the back of an envelope, and I said, I figured out, really, literally on the back of an envelope, that H. pylori eradication, it would be $50,000 per year of life saved if you did test and treat for H. pylori. And Doug said...
And that was just for the general population, or are you looking at target?
And Doug looked at me appalled and said, you can't possibly do it that way. You have to do Markov models and all this other stuff and all this math. And I said, okay, let's do it. So in 1996, we published a paper saying H. pylori eradication, $50,000 per year of life saved. Took us 2 years to come up with that
back of the envelope
number. But one thing that we did show in that paper was that it was less than $10,000 per year of life saved in Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. Okay, it was very.
So why aren't we doing this?
So moving on, I've been to a number of meetings. One in 2014, which was again at IARC, where we said we should be doing this. Mm-hmm. IARC came out and said, if the time is now, people are dying. Why aren't we should be doing something? And we published about it in JAMA and said, this is crazy. We now, our paper in the cost effectiveness said, if it is 30% effective and the treatment only works 70% of the time, it was still cost effective. Those are true numbers. Those are real. We actually are better than that most of the time. So in 2014, we said we should be doing something. And actually, I went back to Doug Owens, who at that point was the head of the task force, and said, why aren't you doing this? And he said, well, it's not, we don't know that this is a big enough issue here in the United States. So,
which Chin just addressed, so now we know it's a big enough issue.
And so we did in that 2014 meeting at IARC say we should focus this on populations at risk, and they should be doing it. They should be testing and treating, and while they're doing it, they should be studying things like changes in the microbiome, antibiotic resistance, whether other things happen that are worse. Do they get more tuberculosis? Is there any other things that happen at the same time? But we shouldn't delay doing it for that. And similarly, we just had a fabulous meeting up in Alaska where we did the same thing, where we said we should be doing something about this. That was read by Dr. Bruce. One group that hasn't been mentioned here are Native Alaskans, Native Americans, who also have very high rates of gastric cancer. Yeah. So my sense is that this is a great segue to the next session, because I think what's needed is advocacy, because I think there are people who are dying, and they're dying predominantly in minority groups, particularly Asian Americans, but other minority groups in the United States, and we need to speak out more vigorously for that and to start doing the work. That's
Yeah,
my feeling about
right.
it.
And I completely agree with you. I mean, our discussions with Doug are that literally the USPSTF have approved these guidelines for hepatitis B, and the numbers are identical, right? They're identical. You know, the incidence of HCC resulting from Hep B infection, and the numbers of Hep B infections, the number of gastric cancers, or the number of people at risk for gastric cancer, and the number of people who develop gastric cancer compared to HCC, they're literally almost identical. And so I told Doug, you guys already have a precedence for doing this. And so I agree. I agree with Chin. I agree with you. I think the numbers are there, and so that's why I specifically made this session. And I told Doug I actually think we have the data right now to go and at least get your input. And I'll actually be somewhat surprised that the data that we have to present is actually better than what was approved for colon cancer screening. But just the burden of the disease for colon cancer screening, and probably the lobby for colon cancer screening, or the political influence for colon cancer screening, was a little bit more effective. I want to segue that to Howard and talk to you about, you mentioned that we need to get congressional support. Why and how? I mean, what are we going to Congress to say, hey, we need help with, what is it? We need help with funding, we need help with policy, and what do we specifically need to ask for?
So I have found in my experience in government that what really moves policymakers is their personal story. And so for the hepatitis example, I keep looking at Dr. So here, there was a Congressional Hepatitis Caucus, actually, that met, and when we unveiled our national hepatitis plan, they were ecstatic because they had something coordinated, unified to present to their constituents. They tried to get more funding for hepatitis-related efforts at the CDC. They presented and attended all of our public events, all our outreach and awareness events. And so, we're now in a different era, and champions like Congressman Honda has stepped away, unfortunately. I miss him so much. But when you have some congressional champions who are on the right committees, and then they can advocate for more funding and research and awareness, it can go a long way. So I think just starting to see where gastric cancer has affected people personally who happen to be in these positions might be a start.
I guess related to that, have you seen examples of congressional support leading to CMS reimbursement, CPT codes, things like that?
Oh, absolutely. So now I'm going to look at Dr. Greenwald, because when we had efforts on colorectal cancer screening improvements, another really very inspiring effort that I was very proud to be part of. We had the American Cancer Society taking that lead, the National Colorectal Cancer Roundtable. At those events, we had congressional leaders. I remember one congressman coming, I can't remember his name specifically, but he had colorectal cancer in his family. I think he was affected himself. Okay, his father, yeah. Right. So when you can connect with the policymakers in that personal way as well as professional way, it can really help humanize the cause. So I think that would be one strategy to discuss.
Fantastic advice. I don't want to hog all the questions, but I'm going to actually, I do want to ask a pointed question to Dr. Umar, and that's related to funding. I mean, what is the current state of gastric cancer funding? You talked a lot about primary prevention, but not much about secondary prevention. I've talked with, again, Doug Owens of the USPSTF, and he said they'd really like to see a randomized controlled trial on secondary prevention and impacting mortality. That's a big study that can only be funded by the NIH. Where are we at, and do we need to lobby Congress to get more funding for that type of thing, and what would be your recommendations?
Yeah. So actually, a good point. I forgot to mention that during my talk, so good that you asked. So there is actually something called Recalcitrant Cancers Act that initially started with really pancreatic cancers, but then lung was part of that, and now I think this year's or last year's appropriations included gastric in that. So what that means is once it's an act, so in the appropriations bill, I don't fully understand, maybe Dr. Koh understand that better, and in terms of, there's a different language in the bill that says that that the Congress recommends or tells us that we need to do more work in that area. So there's definitely, that has risen to that level. I'm sure it was done through some advocacy groups' efforts, but that has led to that effort. So I am planning to at least try and get a concerted effort that will have specifically gastric, but maybe gastric and esophageal together might be more palatable to them as a research effort, both translational research as well as clinical trials. But the clinical trials can just come in as an R01. We don't need to ask for separate funds. That's increase in funds is usually, it doesn't happen to the huge 26 or 29 billion dollar budget for the NIH. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference in adding that specifically for gastric cancer. But there is, in other words, what I'm saying is the money is there. So as long as some of you or many of you put together proposals, clinical trials, screening studies that make sense and can be reviewed favorably by the review committees and go through. We are, on the other hand, to push for those once they come to that point that we need to take it forward once they get reviewed and get them funded and going. I think at least the Recalcitrant Cancer Act addition of the gastric cancers makes a big difference.
Fantastic. We have a question here.
So, Matt Young at the NCI, working with Asad as well. I did a search on gastric cancer in the NCI funding plans. 4 programs came up, which was pretty low, pretty dismal at this point. So it says that there's definitely, and I'll talk about them tomorrow.
Fantastic.
But it says that there's really a lack of pointed studies, directed studies that the NCI's funding.
Yeah.
Because
I think, the other, day 2 is about gaps in research, and what I really wanted to get accomplished there is really what are our research priorities, and try and do this as a community. And I'm glad that the NIH is here. It's almost like an unofficial, program meeting to help identify, research interests, and maybe you can actually sponsor an official meeting to really, hit that home, because, I think that the community is starting to get together, and again, that's the goal of this summit. I called it a summit because I want, stuff to come out of it, not just people to present stuff. So I'm hopeful that, we can interact more. We still have one more day we have tonight, and we can start to solidify some collaborations and maybe come up with a few really good collaborative ideas that we can put forth together to make a difference.
So I'm not supposed to support going to Congress at our level. As Asad pointed out, what's in the appropriation bills, or what Congress actually wrote in. Right. Gastric cancer was lumped in with 3 or 4 other recalcitrant cancers. But the advocacy groups for the early onset colon cancer got a whole paragraph written.
Right.
Okay. So
we just got gastric cancer mentioned.
Yes. So that tells you what's a driver.
Yeah. Well, I think that leads us to the next session. We're going to take a great break, but we're going to talk about advocacy next, and Dr. Koh is going to moderate the next session. Let's take a 20-minute break. We'll take a full 20-minute break, and then we'll come back and reconvene and finish up the program. So thank you very much.